Okay. All right, it's going. Nifty. Okay, so I'm wanting to start by explaining kind of what we're getting at with the questions, both for you and the potential audience. So to do so, I want to contrast a kind of couple of ways of thinking about philosophical books. On one, the book would begin and end with the first, or rather begin with the first sentence and end with the last. On the other, it's a record of a part of a philosopher's life, and in that sense contains neither the beginning nor the end. It reflects a process of active engagement with the philosophical context and one's earlier views as a part of that. So our aim here is to better understand your book in that second way, in part to better understand it in the first, and in part because it's clearly a model of great thinking from which any of us who think stand to learn quite a bit. So that's kind of the overarching framing of the book, or rather the interview, as we've written it up. So moving into the first question, in the preface to Hegel's Critique of Metaphysics, which is a book that started life as your doctoral dissertation, you say that your interest in Hegel's science of logic was sparked initially by your interest in Marx in general, and Althusser's emphasis of Spinoza over Hegel for Marxism in particular. So could you talk us through how you became interested in Marxism, and especially that kind of metaphysical side of it?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, well, that's going back a long time. I first need to give a broader context and then a more academic context. The broader context is, well, I started my studies in philosophy at a time which for you is prehistory. It's 50 years ago, and that was just post-1968. And so many students were political activists, and I was among those. And that's how my interest in Marx first emerged, that I needed to understand it. It was a reference for a lot of the movements with which I was connected. And so I wanted to figure out what was going on there. That's the broader context. The more strictly academic context is that I was a student at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. And one of the directors of studies was Louis Althusser. And he was an incredible teacher. And he was recently the author of For Marx, and Lire le Capital, Read Capital, and a few other texts, Marx and Lenin in front of philosophy and things like that, or Marx and Lenin in front of Hegel. And there was both an effort in those books to apply rigorous epistemological tools to reading Marx's works, and a thesis, which was that there was in those works what Althusser called a term that was quite common in the epistemology, French epistemology of the time, an epistemological break, what Kuhn would have called a change of paradigm from the very early texts, which were mostly governed by the concept of alienation and historical development as directed toward liberation from human alienation. The concept was present, for instance, in the 1844 manuscripts or in German ideology. And then the later texts, as Althusser read them, which he read as more structuralist, like the contribution to the Critique of Political Economy or Capital, and according to which the concept of alienation took second place, and really history should be read as a natural process, causally determined, like all natural processes, even if the causality was more complex in that you had to take into account what he called the efficacy of the structure over the elements. And he thought that move, that break, was a break from a type of thinking that was more Hegelian, teleological, move towards liberation, to a more Spinozistic, naturalistic view of everything about human existence and human history. And even though I was quite sympathetic, I mean, I loved Spinoza as a philosopher, I was quite skeptical that the Hegelian influence waned in the mature texts, especially since Marx himself, and after Marx, Lenin, said that his dialectical method was deeply influenced by Hegel's science of logic. And so I thought, okay, let's go to the source and look at Hegel's science of logic. So that's how my interest started from Marx and then moved to Hegel. And but so you were saying, why was I interested in the metaphysics? Actually, truth be told, my questions were more epistemological than metaphysical. What I was interested in was the method, Marx's method, and what the claims to truth were based on, and how the dialectical method allowed a better approach to the way concepts connected to the way things really are, including historically. What is the specific nature of historical development? So my questions were epistemological, although, of course, I quite recognize that Hegel's science of logic is not at all a logic, didn't claim to be a logic in our sense of the term, but did claim to be a metaphysics, a science of being, and of being as thinking and thinking as being, and how the two, in the end, are the same reality. But my questions were, okay, good, but what is the what is the justification? That's what really interested me. So that's the Hegel and Marx part of my story.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Turn it over to Braeden for the next question.
Sure. Yes. Thank you for that. I suppose still talking about that preface, you say that in that preface that the nature of your interest was transformed over the course of writing the dissertation. At first, you were interested in Hegel as a predecessor to Marx, but then you came to be interested in him primarily as a successor to Kant. So seeing as Kant and the Kantian aftermath have been central to your work ever since, that development seems to be a crucial one in your intellectual life. So I guess based on that fact, could you sort of talk us through this turn from Marx to Kant through Hegel?
Okay, so in a way, the reason is obvious, because once you start reading seriously Hegel's science of logic, you realize that it's permeated through and through by Kantian concepts and by a Kantian type of interrogation. It was especially true. So the science of logic is divided in 3 books: the logic of being, the logic of essence, and the logic of the concept. And I focused, after reading the logic back to back, I decided to focus my dissertation on the second book, the logic of essence, about which Hegel himself said that it was the closest to Kant's transcendental logic, namely a logic that tried to figure out what was the connection between concepts that were a priori, namely had our sources in the workings of our mind, and a reality that was independent of those concepts. For that reason already, that interested me. But there was also the fact that in that book, one found actually ways of understanding the relation between concept and reality that were closest to what Althusser claimed had its source in Spinoza rather than Hegel. And I thought, wait a minute, those structures are present in the logic of essence. In particular, that what started actually, that was the first chapter I wrote, which ends up to be, maybe because of that, the least well developed in the book, the chapter on the relation between ground and conditions, which is really a chapter about the relation between the overall structure of a reality and the way it grounds particular causal processes and their salience in the transformation of reality. So, but that was all, and even the relation between ground and condition already has its source in Kant. And the concept of cause, which Hegel elucidates in that chapter, and the concept of the relation between essence and appearance, all of those are Kantian concepts that sort of Hegel sort of puts into motion, thinks differently, but from a Kantian starting point. And in fact, the whole book, my whole book ended up being called Hegel's Critique of Metaphysics, very much sort of inspired by the critical idea in Kant, even though I acknowledge that Hegel understands critique in a very different sense than Kant does. It's not in order to criticize traditional metaphysics, but rather to reestablish it in a more solid ground. And that's, again, what Hegel himself says. Even though he was very much inspired by the whole conceptual work that goes on in Kant's critique, he says, he's completely in disagreement with Kant's distinction between appearances and things in themselves. And he claims that Kant's whole view is inconsistent if he claims to give us the truth and at the same time says we cannot have any knowledge of things as they are in themselves. Then what is true if we cannot know that? That's what Hegel's view. in the end, I was more sympathetic to Kant than to Hegel. So that explains the turn from Hegel to Kant. I thought Hegel claimed more than he actually justified. And I was more interested. In fact, there was how could I say this? There was a deep reason probably for my primary interest in the doctrine of essence, because I was myself governed by the idea that where there is still fundamentally a distinction between what reality is and the way we know it. And we really want to know how close we can get, and we never can be certain of that. And it was more in my own sensibility. And so in the end, I became more focused on Kant's elucidation of the workings of our mind and what kinds of claims to justification we can make, rather than the much more grandiose speculative claims that Hegel made. That's how the move was then definitively made. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. All right. Okay. Thank you so much for that. So this, I know you said, is kind of a big question. So jumping forward a bit to your next book, Kant and the Capacity to Judge, which I think is perhaps the most helpful guide around for those of us who would like to be Kantians of some sort. Can you talk a bit about how you came to see Kant's theory of judgment in the way that you do in that book? So when did you realize that you had something so important and so importantly different to say about someone about whom so much has been said?
Wow. First of all, thank you for your very kind words. They're really kind, because even though I do hope my book is helpful, I do realize it's sometimes way too complex. And yeah, anyway, now I would write it probably a bit differently for some reasons that we will probably go into in the course of this discussion. But anyway, thank you for the kind words. They're very much appreciated. So I was not going to write on Kant's theory of judgment. That was not initially the plan at all. First of all, I thought I need to go further into Hegel's logic and look at the subjective logic, the logic of the concept. And then I came upon Hegel's criticism of Kant's transcendental deduction. And I decided I need to dive in Kant's transcendental deduction, and boom, I stayed there. I had been interested in Kant very early on in my studies in philosophy, but before the whole story of Marx and Hegel came into the picture. But it was more in Kant's philosophy of science and his metaphysics of nature. So what directed me to the theory of judgment was actually initially the happenstance of hearing a lecture on Kant's logic, and not his transcendental logic. How do concepts a priori apply to objects that are given? How do we have synthetic a priori judgment? Something much more basic, what Kant calls his general formal logic, which is much closer to what we would call logic, even though it's much more elementary to what we know as logic. But it's really an investigation of the forms of valid inference, and what in the forms of our thought make us capable of forming valid inferences and sound inferences that do reach the truth about objects of any kind. Now, Kant taught what he called general formal logic all his life on logic textbooks, which were not written by him. And at the end of his life, but were part of the school logic that everybody had to learn. And at the end of his life, supervised an edition of his own courses on logic, which were put together and edited by one of his students, classical method. Now, the funny thing is that general logic is not supposed to be central at all to the critique. After all, the critique of pure reason, Kant's theory of knowledge and a priori knowledge and the interrogation of the possibility of a priori knowledge, starts with a very strong statement that it would be a mistake to think that general formal logic can serve as an organon for any kind of knowledge. At most, it can serve as a canon, a set of rules, but even the use of those rules needs to be very cautious. So Kant really seems to be sort of setting aside, even though he says it's perfect, it's never changed since Aristotle, there's nothing to change, but because it's so poor, because it has so little to say. And so one didn't really pay attention to what he actually said about logic when he did talk about logic itself. And so, but I went to look at, when I heard that lecture, some light actually lit up in my mind. I thought, oh, right, that's what it is. Because from what he says in the critique, you don't really know. You have to go look at the lectures on logic and at the Yeshe logic, which is his final say on logic. And then, so what I thought was that what that lecture said about the logical forms, categorical, hypothetical, disjunctive judgment, and the Aristotle square of opposites, affirmative, universal, affirmative, particular, negative, universal, really suddenly made sense as forms according to which we reflect upon reality. We reflect upon objects that are presented to us and from which we try to extract concepts. And then I realized that, well, actually, Kant does say, even while cautioning against being too confident that we can get any knowledge from logic itself, he does say at the beginning of his Transcendental Analytic that we can establish a table, an exhaustive table of the categories, namely the a priori concepts that are absolutely necessary in order to get any kind of even empirical knowledge, certainly synthetic a priori knowledge, but even empirical knowledge of objects. We need to think them as falling under those categories. But which categories? Well, he says, categories whose table cannot be exactly derived, but at least set up in parallel to and according to the leading thread of a table of elementary logical forms of judgment. So he does himself tell us, first understand the logic, then you'll understand the categories. And then I tried to figure out, okay, that's well and good, but what about those logical forms themselves? They're supposed to show us how the table of categories is exhaustive, but what about that table itself? Where do we get it from? And there I realized that, in fact, although he said that he was just taking it from textbooks of logic, he was being very, very selective. He wasn't taking all the forms that were presented in the textbooks of logic, and even in his early lectures on logic. And the forms he selected were selected because he thought they were the forms that were absolutely necessary, without which we could not derive any concept at all, whether empirical or a priori, or any empirical concept, let alone a priori concepts from objects that are given. And so I tried to understand why. And there I had to, so that's the first thing, understand what is said in the logic, what are those forms, and the table is very minimal, categorical, SSP, hypothetical understood itself as a combination of categorical judgment, if SSP then Q is R, and disjunctive, which is very different from our disjunctive judgment in propositional logic, which is understood as the division of any genus concept into its subspecies, the disjunction of a concept into its subspecies, where the disjunction is supposed to be exhaustive. And then once you have this exhaustive disjunction, you can say, well, if a concept S is subspecies P, then it's not the subspecies Q, R, S, whatever. If it's either of disjunctive Q, R, S, then it's not, and so on. All those disjunctions, which are just disjunctions of a concept into a species. And so then, so what role do these forms play in reflecting on objects to derive concepts of those objects? That's where the question had to move one step further, namely, and how do we get objects in the first place? Mm-hmm. How do we have objects from which to derive, thanks to the forms of reflection, which are logical forms, that are sufficiently unified entities in our intuition, so that we can compare them according to those forms, the logical forms, and derive empirical concepts. And there, so that was my first point. Why is judgment important? Because Kant says so. Why are the logical forms important? Because Kant says so. And then you understand that they're forms of reflection by looking at the logic. That's what he says. They're forms according to which we reflect upon objects. But then the second question is, how do we get those objects? And there is the second important point in my book, I think, which is the role of imagination. Understanding cannot work on its own. And it cannot work on its own, first, because given the cognitive beings we are, we have to receive information from our senses. And that information we receive from our senses, we organize according to forms of our receptive capacity, which are space and time. So those sensory contents are laid out, as it were, in space and in time, because this is how we lay them out for ourselves in spatial intuitions and temporal intuitions, where intuitions are those immediate and mediated representations we have of singular objects. But how do we have in singular objects? Imagination. So there Kant is the student of Hume. There Kant is directly the heir of Hume. Hume is the one who laid out the rules proper to imagination, which are associative rules. When perceptual content resemble each other, then we associate one with the other. If I see a rose and I've seen roses, or I see a shape, which I now call the shape of a rose, and I've seen similar shapes in the past, this will remind me of those similar shapes. And eventually I will extract what common features they had and extract the concept of rose. But first, how do I get those singular objects? And there Kant says, well, there are the associative. So Hume has itself an associative explanation of that. So he says, for instance, that's his explanation of causal connection. We have similar sequences of consecutive events. So E1, then E2, then a second time, E1 prime, E2 prime, a third time, and several sequences of events of type 1 followed by events of type 2. Then we form a habit of E2 following E1, and then we form an expectation. And Hume says, well, then we project that expectation on the sequences themselves. And we say, there's a necessary connection between E1 and E2. And Kant says, there has to be something more going on. We could go on in life very well, just expecting what will happen and acting accordingly. That's what animals do. We have something more. We look for rules that are true of objects themselves. And that's what the forms of our judgments are. They're just considered simply as merely logical forms. They're forms according to which we look for rules in object. A judgment S is P is a judgment that says that any object X that falls under S also falls under P. It relates concepts to objects. And so we have rules according to which we look for instance, objects that fall under P and under Q. We look for sequences such that if S is P, then Q is R. And those rules, they capture, as it were, they make their own the associations of imagination. And that's what Kant calls the transcendental synthesis of imagination. There's a completely empirical synthesis or combination, which is the associative combination. That's what imagination would do on its own. But imagination captured by what understanding is looking for, then it produces ways in which objects are presented in such a way that then you can look for what specific predicates an object falls under. Given that we know that they will have to have structures such as you have subject and predicate, and you have to have structures such you have antecedent and consequent, and you have to have structures such that objects fall under scales of genus and species, and you can compare them to one another and form not only categorical judgments, hypothetical judgments, disjunctive judgments, but then chains of inferences from one to the other, and boom, the understanding gets going. But that's because it has first captured the associative rules of understanding by imagination. So imagination does its work of synthesizing under a priori rules of synthesis which then get reflected under category. So not just if then, but cause, true of object. But of course, depending on what is actually presented to our senses in sensibility, so we don't invent causal connections. We find them, but because we had the tools to look for them and then find them. So that's the second point, is the role of understanding needs imagination. And of course, imagination has been sort of dismissed, in particular under the influence of Strawson. I love Strawson's book, but he's completely wrong about imagination. You can't understand not only Kant himself, but the richness of what we can derive from Kant in all sorts of areas by paying attention to what he says about imagination. So the second important point. And the third, and I will say much less about it because we need to move on, but the third point, which is equally exciting, I think, is that once you have those two pillars, logical forms of judgment as forms of reflection, but then they can't do anything on their own. You have to have imagination. And the way the syntheses of imagination are geared toward making us capable of reflecting. And so then eventually you derive categories which go much further than anything you would get empirically. Those are the two pillars, logical forms, imagination. Then you get the connection between the first and the third critique, where both concepts, reflection and imagination, are central, and each has its own freedom to function. And then they meet, even when none of them guides the other. They each are free, and lo and behold, they meet. And then you get those extraordinary types of judgment, which are the aesthetic judgments. You cannot get that connection unless you have those two central concepts in place in the right way. So that's what I find most exciting about the book. And people have been, this is a book that has now 20 years, more than 20 years. Yeah, 20 years roughly. And in English, 15 years, I guess. No more, 25 years in English. And people have moved much further with those notions, and I'm very happy with that. So that's what I like about the book. That's what excited me about the book. And I hadn't expected that. What's likable when you write a book is that you're yourself surprised by what you find out. So anyway, that's.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I love that book. So thank you.
Yeah, back to Braeden. So.
I hope it helped. I mean, I don't know whether.
I really appreciated that. Thank you.
Okay. That was very helpful. So I suppose with that previous question, we were moving into the 90s, and I suppose continuing with that. So starting in the 90s, you started to spend more of your time in the United States and publishing in English. So the Anglophone philosophical world is of course different from that of continental Europe in many ways in its approach and concerns, to some extent its concerns. Both the collection Kant on the Human Standpoint and the book we're meeting to discuss today, I, Me, Mine, reflect this new Anglophone setting in many ways. So could you talk some about making that transition? What made you want to make it? How it has changed you as a philosopher, and perhaps how it may have changed your understanding of Kant's achievements also.
All right, there's a lot of questions there, and there would be a lot to say, but I have to be brief because we do want to move to the other book. First, I should note, because that's really an homage to the United States from the beginning, all of my books, believe it or not, even the Hegel book, were, if not entirely written, at least finished in the United States. So I finished the Hegel book when I was a visiting student at Princeton, which was very bizarre at the time to write a Hegel book at Princeton for everyone concerned, me and the faculty at Princeton. But it was incredibly helpful to be there already, even though the style of the book definitely is more continental than analytic, and I will say more about that. Kant and the Capacity to Judge was mostly written in France, Kant et le pouvoir de juger, but finished again during a year in the United States. I was on sabbatical, and my then husband was living in New York, and I joined him in New York for my sabbatical and finishing my book. I want to pay homage to him too. That's Wayne Waxman, to whom I dedicate the book. And he was incredibly helpful throughout that year. It's always a nightmare to finish this kind of book. And he was incredibly helpful and supportive. It was in the US. then Kant and the Human Standpoint, so as a book, it was put together already when I, not only when I had just left Princeton, had just joined NYU. NYU gave me a sabbatical after, they always do that. You arrive, you first teach, and then you immediately are given a leave. And Colin Marshall, your teacher, had just arrived at NYU and was my research assistant on that book. And I want to pay homage to him too. I think the book would not be as clear without Colin as my research assistant. He was incredible in his relentless, okay, but this is not clear. Okay, but that's not quite right. You know, Colin, you know how he is. So he was like that with me too. So so I think that greatly helped in the much clearer style of Kant on the Human Standpoint over Kant and the Capacity to Judge, partly also because of the discussions that Kant and the Capacity to Judge had elicited, and many of the chapters in Kant on the Human Standpoint were initially written as responses to objections, which is something I really love about this country, that it's all about not where you're right, but where you're not right, and might think further, might try to be you know, better support your view. And so that explains a lot, even though, again, in that book, 4 of the chapters, I checked because I was surprised myself, 4 of the chapters were initially written in French, in the French context, even though, and before I came to Princeton, before I came as a faculty to Princeton. So I think I was always very, very keen on learning from the culture, the analytic culture, but it was only gradually that, first of all, my thought matured and my exposure to the analytic style became more intense. And of course, then I came as a faculty to Princeton in '93 to the best analytic philosophers I could dream of interacting with, and then same thing with NYU. Why did I come? Well, it's quite simple. They called me. Princeton called me and offered me a position. And again, it's not something I had planned. I had not planned to come professionally to the US. I had hoped that Wayne Waxman would come to France, which he adamantly wouldn't do because he thought he didn't have the language. It's a fair reason, but I wish it had been different. But then came Princeton's call, and I came, and then I stayed. That's the story, really. But I had always had a great admiration for the way philosophy was done here. So it was, that's the answer. I mean, it's not the whole answer, but I think it's the best I can do in the time we have.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
I appreciate it. So I suppose we're moving in at this point to questions on I Me Mine, or I guess more specifically on I Me Mine. So the first question is as follows. There's a tradition of logical investigation, the referential character of the I, for example, in Wittgenstein, Anscombe, Strawson, Shoemaker, Evans. And it seems like this part of the book, it seems that part of the book, I Me Mine, is about making a contribution to that tradition. Mm-hmm. So can you describe what you take to be some of the kind of central defects in this tradition as it stands, and also what you take to be some of its central insights, the ones that make it work?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So maybe that's one case where I've slightly, you did send me your questions, for which I thank you, and I've slightly transformed my way of, I didn't want to start with the defects, because really what drew me to do some pretty in-depth work on that tradition was first my admiration for its insights. And then I found out what nevertheless was missing. So that's what, and I think I also want to start with how my interests in Kant's type of question then led me to look into that tradition for what I was missing in Kant. And then I realized, well, there was also something missing in that tradition. So initially, I discovered the authors you mentioned, and of course, a few others, at the time when I was trying to understand Kant's analysis of the proposition, I think, specifically, and the role of I, the first person pronoun I, in that proposition. Kant says, it first appears in the context of the transcendental deduction of the categories, the argument to the effect that the categories, thinking under the categories is a necessary condition for having any knowledge of object at all. In the context of that argument, Kant says that the thought or the proposition, I think, is the expression of the consciousness I have of myself as a thinker throughout my thinking. The consciousness of myself and of the identity of myself as a thinker is a necessary condition for my pursuing my thinking. And then he goes on to say, and the form of that consciousness, well, it's the categories. The unity is the unity of thinking under the categories. But he adds, and that's the question on which I then, forgetting the question of the categories, he adds, in being thus conscious of myself as subject, as the subject of thinking, I am not conscious of myself as an object. And it's this distinction between being conscious of myself as a subject and that I kept banging my head against without, I could make some sense of it, but I couldn't really make full sense of it. And it's while I was trying to understand what Kant meant there, that I came upon a distinction in contemporary language analysis of the role of I in language and in thought, both in expressed sentences and in the thought that supposed to express. And the distinction, which was a distinction between two uses of I, not between two types of consciousness, seemed nevertheless similar to Kant's distinction between consciousness of myself as subject and consciousness of myself as an object. And indeed, in most of the authors you cited, there was explicit reference to Kant's original distinction. But the distinction there in philosophy of language was between two uses of I, one which is called the use of I as subject, and the other the use of I as object. And that distinction is borrowed from a particular text of Wittgenstein, which was not published by Wittgenstein itself. What Wittgenstein eventually would have done with it, we don't know. But anyway, it's known as the Blue Book because this is notes preparing for the philosophical investigations that were written up in a blue notebook. And so it's called the Blue Book. And there, Wittgenstein distinguishes what he called the use of I as subject, for which he gives, I'm not going to give all the examples. One of the examples is, I'm in pain, I feel pain. And the use of I as object, for which he gives, well, I'm going to give the example. I'm not going to use his examples. I'm going to give my example, which is closer to an example someone like Shoemaker gives. I'm standing in front of the table on the basis of seeing myself in the mirror. That would be a use of I as object in Wittgenstein's sense. And the way Wittgenstein just gives those examples, and a list of examples which I'm not going to go into. And then he just comments by saying, in uses of I as object, there is room for a certain kind of mistake or error, he says. And there's no room for that kind of error in uses of I as subject. And there's no room for that kind of error that I will start with, because it's especially clear in the case of I feel pain. When you say I feel pain or I'm in pain, there's no room for in case it is true that someone is in pain, that I'm right, I'm justified in saying is in pain, is instantiated. There's no further question, there's no room for error relative to the question, is it I who am in pain? On the basis of my feeling excruciating pain, someone asking, are you sure it's you? Would be really hit in the face. That's just, there's no room for such a question. Whereas when I say, I stand in front of the table, looking at myself in the mirror, there's of course room for the question, okay, someone is standing in front of the table, that's certain. The predicate is instantiated. If I have a good eyesight, if the mirror is not blurred, yeah, everybody would agree, but could ask, are you sure it's you? No, the mirror is tilted in this way, the person doesn't look like, it's not you, it's your sister. There's room for that kind of error. That's the distinction between use of I as subject, use of I as object. And Wittgenstein concluded that in the use of I as object, I refer to a person, the person referred to by using the first person I, whereas in the use of I as subject, there's no referential role at all because there's no room for the question. Who is in pain true of? I'm just expressing my pain. When I say I'm in pain, it's another way of moaning, Wittgenstein said, which is kind of implausible. There's no articulation of moaning, whereas there are articulation, at least in the form of a proposition in I'm in pain. And there's been a lot of debate over Wittgenstein was right in establishing the distinction in this way. And an answer that was very popular among the people you cite, Shoemaker, Evans, McDowell, Kassam, and they had different arguments, which all nevertheless landed on the same conclusion. No. It's not that one is referential. I refer to a person, I can ask which person is the predicate true of, and the other doesn't refer at all. And that's why there's no question which. No, they said the distinction is not that. In both cases, I refers to a person, and so to an embodied entity, but they refer on the basis of a different type of information about the predicate. And on the basis of one type of information, it might be true that the predicate is true of the referent of I, but I might also be mistaken. And in the other case, no, if the predicate is true of anyone, on the basis of the information I have, it's obviously true of me. And so Shoemaker reformulated the distinction by saying, in one case, the use of I subject, that immunity to error through misidentification relative to the first person. No. If I know the predicate to be true, I know it to be true of the referent of I. And in another case, there's no such immunity. And then they said, so Wittgenstein was mistaken in his interpretation of his own distinction, however important. And Kant, and that's Strawson's praise of Kant. Kant had the incredible insight way before the distinction was made that the whole mistake of the rationalist metaphysicians, when they thought, and there it was a way of reading Kant's criticism of Descartes' cogito, which was quite explicit indeed in Kant. He criticized Descartes' cogito argument. Descartes thought, not only in thinking I think, do I have indubitable certainty that I exist, but also that I think, and that I exist on the basis of the fact that I'm certain that I think. But moreover, I thereby know that I exist as a thinking thing, and as a thinking thing, which, since I'm certain of its existence, even when I'm not certain of the existence of anything else, I'm certain exists as a thinking thing, distinct from anything else. And in particular, distinct from the body, to which ultimately it's intimately associated, sixth meditation, but it's distinct. So, and Strawson said, Kant had the incredible insight to say, well, in fact, the argument of the rationalist metaphysicians who assert the existence of a soul rests on a misunderstanding of the use of I, namely because I does not, in the proposition I think, does not obviously refer to a body, even while I'm certain that I think, it has to refer to a different type of entity, namely a soul distinct from the body, a different type of object. And Kant was right to say, no. In I think, I does not refer to an object. If by object we mean an embodied entity, we mean a soul, but there is another object that I always refers to, as all our guys have shown. It's an embodied entity, except it refers in a different way on the basis of a type of information which is immune to error through misidentification relative to that entity. And initially I thought, this is great, this is wonderful. First of all, the distinction between use of I as subject and use of I as object, just by that immunity or lack of immunity to error with respect to the question, who is the predicate true of? Is it I or someone else? It's such a simple, clear view. So not only did it seem to offer a clarification of Kant's distinction, which was much simpler, clearer, well-formulated, but it was a two-prong, as it were, hit, namely clarification of Kant and clarification of what was wrong with rationalist metaphysicians. They were just wrong about the use of I. And Kant said that too, of course. Kant said that too. They misunderstand a consciousness of oneself as subject and the use of I that's based on that consciousness in I think. And the consciousness of oneself as an object, which can only be the consciousness of an embodied entity, but which is distinct from the consciousness I have of myself in I think, because that consciousness of myself as thinking is the condition for any consciousness of object. It's not itself a consciousness of object. So in a way, yes, there is a distinction between two uses of I, one based on consciousness of oneself as subject in I think, and all other uses of I, which are not the uses in I think. But then the question is, yeah, but what about all those other uses of I as subject that are immune to error through misidentification relative to the first person pronoun? They're not uses of I in I think. That's different. It's a different question. And what you're missing if you just identify the two, it's not that one is wrong and one is right. It's just that they're not the same distinction. And if you just focus on two different uses of I as defined in the Blue Book, then there's all sorts of discussions of whether that's the last word in Wittgenstein, it's not, whether there are other distinctions, but remaining with that question, it's clear that even though those two distinctions are interesting and related, it's not the same distinction. And so that leads me to what was missing. What was missing in that distinction, which I found so interesting? It's that what Kant is really after is what makes it possible to use I at all. And what makes it possible to use I at all is the consciousness of a unity of a mind that I take, or a mental activity of which I don't know what is it, what kind of entity is bearing it. Is it embodied? Is it not embodied? Is there distinction between mind and body? Is it another type of entity altogether that grounds both what I call mind and what I call body that I refer to when I use I in I think? We don't know. But we do know is that we use I on the basis of being capable of a certain unification of mental contents that we thereby take to be our own. That's it. And so I thought there's much more to understand about just that. What type of unification of mental contents makes possible the use of I? And that's what was just left by the wayside, very much because of the type of suspicion people like Strawson, namely the whole Wittgenstein, post-Wittgenstein tradition had against anything smacking of psychology. And I was reintroducing interrogation of psychological processes, which again, other people have done. So for instance, someone like Tyler Burge, someone like Christopher Peacock, someone like Tim Bain have taken into account that aspect of Kant's view, and it's becoming more and more prominent. But in that original relation between a semantic distinction and a type of consciousness distinction, that had gone by the wayside, and that's what I found the limitation. And by the way, that where in contrast, I found the connection to Freud, which I think is also something you wanted to ask me about.
Well, I appreciate that. Very thorough answer. That's phenomenal. And again, I'll pass it back over to Braeden so he can go to the next question.
Yeah. That was a really interesting answer. Yeah, so I suppose, that moves nicely into sort of the other tradition with which I Me Mine heavily engages, and that's sort of this empirical or more naturalistic inquiry into the nature of self-consciousness. And I suppose the most important representative of that tradition in 90 minus Freud. So we wanted to ask, similarly relating this tradition back to Kant, with what insights can that naturalistic tradition represented by Freud enrich the Kantian tradition? And what does, do you think the Kantian tradition have to offer that naturalistic tradition into inquiry into self-consciousness?
Okay, these two are very, very rich questions, and I'm sure my answers will be very incomplete. So first, I should say that comparing Kant's view to the naturalistic tradition is a much broader project than just comparing Kant to Freud. It's true that, as I just said, the idea of comparing Kant's view of the mind to Freud's view of the mind is what first sort of lit a light in my mind. Oh, wait, there's a whole naturalist tradition that would be interesting to look at in that respect. But that naturalistic tradition is much broader than Freud. And actually, it started practically already in Kant's time. The idea that, well, you know, Kant's view of the organization of the mind has to have a physiological counterpart, as it were. So for instance, there's a funny story, which is the story of Sömmering, who was one of the big names of brain studies at the time, which were very, very, very at elementary stage. But he was one of those who was trying to start finding correspondence between neural sort of terminations in the brain and certain functions of the mind. And he sent his book, he had great admiration for Kant, and he sent his book to Kant saying, I found a physiological counterpart to your theory of the mind, which is so great. So, and Kant was, oh, wait a minute. No, that's not how I think. So, but it started very early on, and then it developed throughout the 19th century. There's a very big name in that respect, which is Hermann Helmholtz, who's the one who came up, I think, with the expression organization of the mind, and who thought that you could actually find not a reductive account, but at least it was worthwhile trying to figure out how, for instance, what Kant called the a priori forms of space that are necessary to our coming up with even just intuited wholes, work, how the way we came up with spatial and temporal representations were related not only to the way objects affect us, but the way we move our own body, and the way we associate the motions of our own body to the way even just the elementary sensory aspects of objects change, which is an idea actually that had already been developed in 18th century empiricist tradition. Locke had done a lot about that. But he developed that much further. He thought that perception was itself pervaded with inferences, and he wrote a very major paper about that. So anyway, there was a whole naturalist tradition running with Kant's ideas in the 19th century, and Freud is, historically speaking, the heir of that tradition, very directly through his teacher in neurology, I think it was Meinert, I'm confusing two names here, Meinert, who was himself a student of Helmholtz, and so on. It goes back like that. So there's a direct tradition. And I think it is worth exploring, even though it has been the object of a lot of suspicion in the name of the irreducibility, of course, of mental normative functions to mere causal processes or causally determined processes. And if you try to find a connection, it has to be non-reductionist, because certainly mental functions have to be understood in their own terms. But of course, the heirs of that are now cognitive psychology and neuropsychology. There's no going against that. And I think it's a very interesting project. So it's much broader than Freud. Now, Freud himself, and Freud, okay, now let me not try to say too much at a time. My interest in comparing Kant and Freud came with exactly the kind of limitations, the sort of realization of the limitations in that other tradition, the semantic tradition, I had come to be uncomfortable with. And I thought, well, if I'm right that at least as important as the Wittgensteinian tradition as an heir of Kant, which I think it is definitely, whose question was the question of the referential or non-referential role of I, was another tradition which was about the way using I is grounded in certain organizations of mental functions. And there you have really a direct statement to that effect in Freud, who done what Freud calls, what we've come to translate in Latinate English as the ego, in Freud is called das Ich. And what he means by das Ich is not directly the first person pronoun, but an organization, what Kant called the unity of apperception, which finds expression in I think. And Freud directly called what Kant called the unity of apperception, das Ich. And he made that explicit as an organization of mental processes governed by the reality principle, namely aiming at getting things right about reality, Kant's objective unity of apperception, and governed by elementary logical rules. I thought, my God, that's exactly how the unity of apperception starts in Kant. Now, one will object, and I've received the objection, and it's perfectly fair, that Freud has nothing like a doctrine of the categories. It has nothing like Kant's complex view of how the categories have to govern not only perceptual knowledge, but the science of nature, how we get science of nature from applying the... Freud has nothing like that. It's not his problem. His problem is to understand how various functions originate in the mind and how eventually they become pathological, maladaptive, not functioning properly because das Ich, the ego, finds countervailing forces in das Id, das Es, the drives, the passionate aspects of the life of our mind, and the superego, the moral aspect. But really, the original structure is very, very similar, but the questions are different. So Freud is not going to solve Kant's questions, and Kant is not going to solve Freud's question. And we could say the same about morality. I mean, another question I get often is, but did Freud even read Kant? Of course he read Kant. And Kant is the philosopher he quotes most after Plato. The philosopher he quotes most is Plato, and the second is Kant. And he quotes Kant about space, about our not having knowledge of our mind as it is in itself. He quotes Kant about the categorical imperative a lot, and has his own explanation of the genealogy of the categorical imperative. And so I was interested by all this. Yeah, so that's the origin of my interest in Freud, but of course you cannot take it on its own. You have to understand it in the context of the naturalist tradition and how far can it go. And so, yeah, one of your questions I think was, and so how much does each tradition bring to the other, the Kantian to the naturalist to the Kantian? I think that was part of your question, wasn't it? So my answer there would be, well, what the Kantian tradition brings, they said themselves. I mean, the physiological Kantianism said, we learned so much from Kant's view of the mind, and now we want to understand how it can be explained in naturalistic ways. And they did derive a lot. Some of their questions are derived from that. Questions about, what's the role of inference in perception, questions about what is the role of the categorical imperative in our moral life, and so on. The more complicated question, of course, is, what does the naturalist tradition have to bring to Kant? And probably a strict Kantian would say, nothing at all. We want no part of that. And of course, I get that a lot, and I understand that. But I do think that if we take seriously Kant's questions, I think there is a lot to be gained from paying attention to the naturalist tradition. In terms of cognition, it's obvious, and Kant himself, made all the use he could make of the concepts he derived from the empirical psychology of his time, while saying, but my questions are different, and empirical psychology is not going to answer them. Similarly, we can try to make all the use we can of what the much richer, greater, far-ranging knowledge of the actual functioning, empirical functioning of the mind we have available today, while saying, oh, but our questions are different. And so how can we use those concepts and answer questions about justification? What types of justification do we have for our knowledge claims? What kinds of justification do we have for our moral claims? No empirical investigation is going to give answers to those questions. There are different types of questions that call for different types of methods, but had better be informed. But what we do know about the mind. So that's how I would answer that question. I think I'm about, yeah, there's nothing more I really want to go into here.
Well, thank you so much for that answer. That was really interesting. I think there's one more question, which I will give to Nate.
All right. So this last question so an important question facing Kant scholars today is, what is to be done with Kant? There's a little allusion back to the first question, I suppose. It seems that one central task of this book is to answer that question.
Mm-hmm.
So the answer you provide differs from that of, say, Henry Allison or Karl Emerichs or Peter Strawson or John McDowell.
Mm-hmm.
So what have you learned from previous answers to this question? Including some of those or whichever ones you're interested in. And where do you think they've gone astray?
All right. So I think I have 3 stages of answer. The first is, I don't think anybody has the answer to the question, what is to be done with Kant? And I'll say more about why I think that. But there's one answer that everybody should agree on, at least, I think everybody, then implementing it to various degrees, depending on what it is exactly you want to do with your life as a philosopher. But the first thing to be done is read his work carefully and seriously. Try to understand how the 3 critiques fit together. It's not just the first or just the second or just the third, it's how they fit together and then how they fit with the rest. I mean, it's an enormous labor to read Kant. And for that reason alone, it, of course, pushes many people. One cannot do everything in one's life, even in one's life as a philosopher. So we need to count on each other, scholars and non-scholars, scholars and people who define themselves more as systematic philosophers than as historical scholars, but at least admit that Kant has to be read seriously and as a system and in the terms of the questions he inherited and was trying to solve. Otherwise, we miss so very much. On the other hand, I have a much less dogmatic and dismissive view than I had when I was a strict French person about doing things non-historically. I think we also learn a lot from the attempts of non-historians to use Kantian concepts, and I'm very grateful for that. So as long as we admit that each approach is limited and has to learn from the other. So that's my first answer. Read Kant seriously, take him seriously in his own terms, and as a whole system, not just little pick of this and of that, even though nobody can do everything. My second answer is, okay, but even as serious Kant scholars, interpretations differ. And that's where your question about the various authors you mentioned, Allison, Emerichs, I think you name also McDowell and Strawson, and who else you name? Anyway, those were the one you named, right? Allison, Emerichs, Strawson, McDowell, and probably there are others, yeah. So I'll just play the game of saying, so where I agree, where I disagree, and even as Kant scholars. So first, the first 2 acts different from the second 2. The first batch of 2 is different from the second batch because the first would define themselves as Kant scholars, and not exactly as Kant scholars, but exactly contemporary systematic philosophers who take a lot from Kant. And I think both approaches are very, very important. So take Allison, for instance. I think I have a fundamental agreement with Alison about the famous one world, two world question. I agree with him on his fundamental thesis that appearances and things in themselves are not two classes of things or two classes of properties of things, which is both positions have been held and are held by other Kant scholars whom I respect enormously, but rather two ways of considering one and the same reality. And one is negative, reality considered independently of the tools we have to know it, things in themselves. And then you can also define it as noumenal in the negative sense, not the object of a sensible intuition, but not noumenal in a positive sense, because I have no idea what that might be. Although some people would disagree about that too. And some of my most distinguished colleagues disagree about the fact that about the noumenal in a positive sense, we cannot say anything at all. And so, but I agree with Alison on this basic approach. There's one reality and then there's different ways of considering it. One is pretty empty, the other is extremely rich by the means of the tools we do have to approach it. But I disagree with him then about those tools themselves and what it means to say, well, we know things only as they appear to us, namely by way of the tools we have to know it. So I could list a few, so you can see, so we've had public debates, Henry Allison and myself, about the relation of space and time in the transcendental aesthetic as mere forms of receptive capacity, sensibility, and space and time as they reappear in the transcendental deduction, when Kant says, but the unity of space and time depends on the unity of our perception. And I say, but already in the aesthetic, they were presented as one. So it means we have not to reinterpret it, but to understand a lot of what was said in the aesthetic in light of what is said. And he disagrees with that. And he has arguments, and I have arguments, and we go back and forth, and some people agree with me, and some people agree with, yeah, well, I think I'm right. I think I'm right, but I agree that there's a lot of discussion to be had. We also agree about the importance of the notion of reflection, even in the first critique. But we disagree about what it means for the doctrine of the categories. Henry Allison thinks that I therefore neglect the role of the categories. I don't think I neglect it at all. I think it's essential, but we need to bring in imagination in addition to categories as pure concepts of an object, insofar as that object is considered as in agreement with the, or as he puts it, when he defines a category is a concept of an object, insofar as the intuition of that object is in itself in agreement with one or the other of the logical functions of judgment. That's the definition of a category. So it's a concept of an object. A logical function is not the concept of an object. Nevertheless, it's the concept of an object, blah, 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 with the rest of the definition. So he thinks I neglect the categories. No, I don't neglect the categories, but you have to bring in what it is that makes the object have an intuition in itself in agreement with one or the other of the logical function of judgment. You need to bring in the synthesis of imagination, and the categories an a priori concept of a particular synthesis of imagination. So we disagree about that. So one should never reduce a position to one, sort of simple view. It's always more complex than that. And that's why disagreements in philosophy are interesting. Okay, I could say the same with Karl Emmerich's. I admire Emmerich's book about Kant's theory of mind enormously. I think it's been for a long time the only one that really took seriously, or at least not the only one, but the best one that took seriously Kant's theory of mind. I think it's still among the best. And I think I'm still discovering things reading his book, but I disagree with him. I think, and I'm sure he disagrees with me, that I think he, at least as I understand him, think Kant in the end agrees with much more of the traditional rationalist metaphysics than I do. So we disagree. And I think I'm right, and I'm sure he thinks he's right, and we have to continue discussing. So that these are interpretive disagreement. So same thing I could say about Strawson and McDowell insofar. So there it's a bit more slippery because there's an acknowledgement that on their part that they're not Kant scholars. And nevertheless, because of their sort of own systematic views, they privilege one or the other of Kant's aspect of Kant's views and think the others are to be neglected. And I think that's maybe a more serious mistake, not to have the systematic views they hold, but to attribute them to Kant and not to acknowledge that something of Kant is thereby missed. I mean, I think more work should be done to make it clear what it is you give up and what justification you have to give it up. But again, I admire their work so much that nobody can do everything. And it's also on systematic grounds, because of my own views, I'm sure, that I disagree with McDowell, for instance, in thinking that perception is directly conceptual. I think work has to be done to make the objects of perception conceptual. That's again my whole story of imagination. But that is due probably also to, I mean, the fact that I'm so much in agreement with Kant, even from me, comes from the fact that I have my own views about the matter, which I'm happy to see developed in Kant. So this is about agreements, disagreements, and I could take other authors in the same way and list reasons for admiring and reasons for disagreeing. Paul Guyer, Hannah Ginsburg, Alan Wood. I mean, all the major names are people from whom I have learned a lot and then find disagreements with. That's what makes us then move forward. But that in itself does not answer the most important question: what should we do with Kant as contemporary philosophers? I guess that's ultimately what is to be gained from Kant. A little bit like you were asking me, what does traditional Kantianism have to learn from a naturalist approach? What does naturalism have to learn from Kant? In contemporary philosophy, what should be done with Kant? In other words, is Kant merely a remarkable historical object, which we can still take pleasure in studying, like you will forever study works of music and interpret them, play them. I think one of the remarkable things about Kant's system, which I think is probably true of any philosophical system, but I don't think as profoundly true of any system, to the degree to which it is true of Kant's system, which is that almost immediately, and then on and on and on and on through the centuries, so many different philosophical systems have made a claim to be the ones who, if not most faithfully, most productively and philosophically creatively taken their inspiration from Kant. So it starts with German idealism, and then it continues, and almost at the same time with Schopenhauer, whom I could list as a version of naturalism against transcendental idealism, continue with the naturalist school in 19th century, which is actually inspired by Schopenhauer quite explicitly, while rejecting the metaphysical aspect of Schopenhauer's views. Helmholtz explicitly claims not only Kant, but also Schopenhauer, but doesn't want the heavy metaphysics of Schopenhauer's theory of the will, but then continues with neo-Kantianism, which opposes both German idealism and naturalism, but then it continues with Heideggerian phenomenology, which opposes all of the above, and all of those, nevertheless, claim the heritage of Kant. Of course, I have sympathy for some more than others. I think I would say that my own heritage is a combination of naturalism and neo-Kantianism, for reasons that should be, I hope, relatively clear from what I said. Namely, I do agree that no empirical naturalistic approach will account for the type of normative concepts that Kant tries to put into place. In that sense, I'm a neo-Kantian, but I'm convinced of the importance of the naturalistic approach. In that sense, I'm a naturalist. And I don't believe in appealing to any other world than the natural world and the historical development that takes place for human beings within the natural world. In that sense, I'm a naturalist. And I think the very richness of the Kantian system is as it were, witnessed to by the variety of those diverging interpretations. And I think in that way, I'm also a Kantian in that I think what Kant said in the first critique, you do not learn a philosophy, you learn to do philosophy. And learning to do philosophy, and so this is where also there's something really interesting where Wittgenstein is the heir. Learning to do philosophy is learning what you should not do in philosophy, where the illusions come from. And Wittgenstein and the philosophy of language, that's one of its limitations too, I think, has too limited a view of where the illusions might come from. It's not just from language, although language, of course, and analyzing the uses of language and where they lead us astray is very important, but the illusions have many other sources. And the idea that one of the major roles of philosophy is therapy against illusions, against the wrong way to go if you're going to have tools to justify what you are claiming. I think that's the most important. And I also think that Kant's three main questions, what can I know? What should I do? What am I allowed to hope? Are still the three main questions. It's to be noted, of course, that among those are not what is the fundamental nature of reality, even though Kant did write two metaphysics. And they are not the metaphysics that a lot of my distinguished colleagues with whom I disagree think Kant returns to on the basis of morality. They are a metaphysics of nature and the metaphysics of morals. The only two metaphysics Kant wrote are a metaphysics of nature and a metaphysics of morals, the first taking on at least the minimal empirical sort of material, which is bodies as moving in space, and the other persons as being both embodied, but having a priori mental structures that make them capable of both cognitive, moral, and aesthetic normativity. That's, for me, it's enough. For me, it's enough. But of course, some people give much more than I do to Kant's doctrine of moral belief and how it reintroduces the objects. I think we should take seriously what Kant says and say, well, that is just belief. Metaphysics is supposed to be systematic, objective knowledge, even if the systematic justification is not just the traditional cognitive justification in the metaphysics of nature, but the normative justification in the metaphysics of morals. That's okay. So that's, it's a bit of a long-winded answer to what we should do with Kant, but I hope it, yeah, just follow the lesson, follow the lesson, and then go on your own.
That's an incredible answer. Thank you so much. Learned a lot. That's incredible. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah.
Oh, yes, I suppose I want to echo what Nate says, and thank you so much for having agreed to participate in a conversation with us and allowing us to discuss your work with you. I think we both have greatly benefited from both studying the book, from writing the questions, and of course from discussing the book with you. So thank you very much, Professor Longuenesse.
Well, thank you, because I really thought about your questions. I thought they were great questions, and always trying to think about questions is really, really helpful. So thank you.
Thank you. I'm glad you did.